Okie dokie. Last one. So let's talk about labor. Actually, let me move back with women for a second. Women were so important to the national effort. I don't know. The women contribution is just so absurdly unimportant, Taylor, that I don't know why we need to talk about it. But just for you, I suppose, the 19th Amendment is going to be passed partly as a result of women's contributions economically, and they will be granted political status. And as you've seen before in some of the things I showed you in the Progressive Era, many states already had the right to vote, but now in 1920 women got the right to vote. Workers specifically had some problems in that inflation became a really big deal. More and more, as prices were increasing more and more, wages weren't keeping up with it. So you actually saw lots of strikes. And so in reaction to lots of these strikes, the government created the National War Labor Board as a way to deal with these strikes. They didn't want workers striking during the war because they needed goods being manufactured. So it was co-chaired, Walsh and Howard Taft co-chaired it to oversee labor disputes. And essentially what they're trying to do is get workers not to strike. Well, how do you get workers not to strike? Well, one way is you give them benefits. You give them a reason not to strike. So the War Labor Board was instrumental in bringing about some pretty progressive worker reforms. 8-hour workday, rights to unionization, better wages. Even Samuel Gompers was on the National War Labor Board as a part of the board, and he was, head of the AFL, right, a huge labor union. So the workers having their right to unionize, the recognition of unionization, is that a word, perhaps? And 8-hour workday, better wages. America's starting to consider benefits now. We've already talked about the progressive reforms that came around, workmen's compensation, child labor laws, and now America's seeing some more of these reforms because they have to during the war effort. The war changes things socially. Wars, because of the government needs to get things done quickly, is much more likely to make quicker decisions, and you see that you have these changes. You have migratory changes. You have women getting rights. You have labor organizations getting rights. You have the federal government getting much stronger with the central government. The IWW, they struck a whole bunch, about 6,000 times, because what they saw was, since the war effort needed to be focused on, then that means that gave union workers leverage. And they tried to use that leverage. Someone called the Wobleys radical, and they were hurting America's production. Others were saying they were standing up for the rights of union members. A lot of them were arrested and beat up. Probably by Austin's relatives, I would suppose. I'm just sort of kidding. The war economy. Herbert Hoover, who will later become president, was incredibly instrumental in helping the poor. Let me get my map, just like Dora. All right. When the baby-killing Germans came through Belgium, millions of Belgians were starving because the Germans came through. Crops were destroyed, the Belgians were suffering. Herbert Hoover was able to, he was an engineer, he was able to get volunteers to provide food to millions of Belgians, and was credited with saving hundreds of thousands of lives. He was put in charge of the American Food Administration. And he was a Quaker, and he preferred, again, to work on voluntary compliance. He was not going to force Americans to change their food consumption patterns, but he mostly used propaganda and, guilt to get Americans to comply. And so you see newspapers and movies and little film shorts and billboards, posters. They're asking people to have wheatless Wednesdays and meatless Mondays to try to sacrifice so that food can go to the war effort. Victory gardens were encouraged to put, it's going to be a lot more in World War II, but victory gardens were encouraged for people to put in their yards to raise their own food, so whatever food they're not eating can go to the war effort. He also did try to fix prices, like farm prices, much higher. The higher the food prices, it's going to incentivize farmers to make a lot more food, and the more food that was being incentivized and made, it was able to be sent over to Europe. In fact, the American farmers were feeding most of Europe and America at this time, and it was pretty great because of the increased food prices. Also, this huge spirit of self-denial. It became popular with voluntarism to deny yourself meat or wheat on Sundays, or gas for your fires, and also became popular to deny yourself alcohol because many important foodstuffs went into alcohol, right? Beer has its stuff, has hops and barley and wheat in it, and most alcohols have some food products in it that could be going towards the war effort. And Progressives, the Women Christian Temperance Union, that hose beast of an organization, used this as a way to finally push forward the 18th Amendment, which was also signed as a result of this war, and Prohibition started. So we get the 18th and 19th Amendment. You see massive changes in migratory patterns. Women get more rights. Workers get more rights. Central government gets stronger. We're taking away civil liberties. World War I has tons of stuff going on just in America. And how are they going to pay for it? Well, they're going to pay for it two ways. One, part of it is through taxes, but the biggest part of it was through Liberty bonds, buying bonds. What a Liberty bond is the government, let's say the government needs money now. So the government will ask for you to buy a bond. And you'll give the government, let's just say, for example, $100. Right? And let's say it's a 5% bond, which means, and let's say it's a 5-year bond. So a 5-year bond at 5% for $100, which means every year, and what's 5% of $100 is $5? So every year you get $5 back from the government, and on the 5th year you get $5 back, plus you get your $100. So individuals are making money off of this as an investment, and the government's getting money up front that needs to fight the war. Unfortunately, they were so good at selling this that so much money was put into currency that we actually had inflation. But this paid for a huge portion of the actual war. So that's how the war's paid for. Let's talk about mobilizing the army. Alright? In terms of mobilizing the army, the Allies by April and May of 1917 were running out of people.
After staff, we just want to remind you that there is food over in the media center for this evening. Also, room 207, the day room, is open and available if you would like to go in and look at the student cards and put your post-it notes on there this evening if you would like to do that instead of waiting until next week. Thank you and enjoy this evening.
Okay. So a lot of Americans were hoping not actually to have to fight with guns. They were hoping the American Navy and the American production of goods would be enough help to help turn the tide of the war. But unfortunately, the Allies were running out of troops. And as we talked about before, trench warfare was so brutal, troops were running low. And so in 1917, in the middle of 1917 in May, unpopularly, Wilson was able to sign off on the Selective Service Act, or a draft. And everyone who was 18 to 45 had to enter the draft. Unlike the Civil War, you couldn't buy your way out. So rich people couldn't buy their way out of the draft. Although if you owned a big company that the war needed stuff from, you could. There wasn't a lot of bloodshed. There were several 100,000 slackers who tried to escape the draft. But it went off pretty peacefully. Over 4 million Americans were drafted in the war. Over 400,000 African Americans enlisted. A lot of women enlisted in the war. So it was relatively successful, the draft was, and America got a much bigger army. They had to train the army. And the American soldiers were known as doughboys because they were fresh-faced when they got off the ship in England. When they would be shipped over, they were pretty popular amongst English women. And they were needed because the Germans were sinking Allied goods at a mass pace, much faster than they could actually make more ships. The Allies started having a convoy system. A convoy system is when the tanker ship that has the goods in it is surrounded by naval vessels to keep safe, and they would keep a lookout for the U-boats, and when they would communicate, the boats would, and when they would find the U-boat, they could sink it. And this dramatically helped limit the power of the U-boats. Unfortunately for the Allies, in mid-1918, Russia withdrew from the war. Actually, I'm sorry, in 1917, late 1917, early 1918, Russia withdrew from the war. And if you're Germany, you love this, because what can Germany do? He said rhetorically, assuming that people in his class would answer, even though no one's studying in his class. Okay, Germans would move everyone over to this front. And now the Germans actually had superiority. But Wilson was also worried because the communist revolution was, he thought, going to be a threat to liberty. In fact, there was this unknown war where Wilson actually sent 10,000 troops to fight against the communists in their civil war that we haven't talked about a lot in Murmansk, which is really north up there. But Wilson believed that communism was a huge threat to democracy, and he invested 10,000 troops in the fight against the communists. So there's that. I'm going to stop, and then we're going to get to the actual little bit of fighting and the end of the war and what's happening after the war. So on Monday we'll talk about that. We'll finish it up on Tuesday, and I've got tons of primary evidence. But remember, you've got Zindu Tuesday and Henrietta due on Monday, chapter 22, and I'll have copies for people who want to start Zen after this. This should last about, I don't know, almost an hour if you want to start in on that. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.